there are really two basic states of being. You're either in love or you're in fear. And fear, then creates a host of other things like anxiety, depression. It could create anger and apathy and all of these negative emotions, where love puts us in the present moment. It allows us to even be in heart and brain coherence so that we're in a brainwave state that is more creative. And the only place that we can create from is when we're in the present moment and when we're in the state of love, right?
Hi, everybody. This is Carol Mirko again from A Loud Voice for Love. And today's guest, today's loud voice for love is Nathalie Molina Niño. And I had the great pleasure of meeting Natalie in Carol Hyatt, God bless her. I think she's in her 90s, living her green living room in New York City many years ago, and we've sort of woven in and out of each other's lives in different capacities. I mean, Natalie's known me when I was doing heirloom meals, and then I was back in the finance world in a crowdfunding equity fund, and she introduced me to some really amazing women, and then I kind of just drifted out of that. And I know that my purpose in life through my own healing journey is to help people understand the difference between fear and love, right? To get people out of fear and into love. Because when you're in fear, you cannot be creative. You cannot be a creator. And I'm interviewing people that I know have done things from that place of love so that they can actually make a difference in their own lives, but in the lives of the people that they work with and in their communities. So Natalie is the co-founder and president of Known. She's an entrepreneur, builder capitalist, and technology globalization veteran focused on high growth businesses that benefit from people and planet. Um, and as a technologist and coder by training, she's a consummate entrepreneur and storyteller at heart. And that's the part we love, the storyteller. So welcome, welcome, Natalie. I so appreciate you agreeing to come on. And I'm going to just let you talk a little bit about who you are and what motivates you and why it's so important, because you wrote a LinkedIn post that had, the fact that we really need to get back to the whole to love in everything that we're doing. And I just was like, you got to be on my show. So, so welcome.
Thank you. First of all, I always love being in conversation with you. So yes, the answer is always yes. But I think in some ways, who I am is probably a lot less what's reflected in these bios, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of what I've done, and it always has been informed by who I am. But sometimes, as I think with a lot of people, the road can be really circuitous. And when you're in it,
Yes.
you don't necessarily know where you're going, but you're always going the right way if it's rooted in something that is true and that is honest and that is about you, at the very core, right? And I think that when I think about what I'm about, sort of at my core, is there are all sorts of stories of me as a little kid. I was very literal. And so, for example, I didn't understand how my parents would tell me not to kick the dog and, to be gentle with the
Mhm.
little baby chick that somebody handed me at at a farm, and all of these very consistent messages that said, be kind to
Yeah.
animals, right? And then they would serve me one at dinner. And
Mhm.
as a little kid, I didn't understand how those two things could coexist. And long story short, I'm a vegetarian and I have been my entire life. When I was 10 years old, is when I was officially a vegetarian. And that
Mhm.
was really a meaningless marker, because 10 was simply when my parents, I think, just got so tired of forcing me to eat meat that I didn't want to eat. That at 10, it wasn't so much when I became a vegetarian, it's when they gave up
Yeah.
trying to force me to be something else, you know? And I, you know, it's a funny story, but it's probably somewhat a reflection of who I am still, right? There is this inherent sense of consistency and justice
Yes.
that somehow I understood, I think, from when I was born. And it was something that for some reason I could never shake. I think a lot of people are probably born the same way, but the world beats it out of us and tells us to look the other way, and that, well, yeah, this is kind of unjust, but what can you do? And after like time after time of giving up, or maybe of the world giving you messages that you need to give up, somehow this thing that I think probably we all held pretty close to our hearts, some of us start to sort of release it. And I have been lucky enough to look, you know, at the end of the day, the parents did give up, right? My sense of justice won. And so I think I was lucky enough that perhaps it didn't get beat out of me the way that it has for a lot of other people.
Yeah. What a beautiful story and framing of like, and I do really appreciate how when we're forced to write these bios, right, that kind of take the very limited words, right,
Yeah.
and you know, for a particular audience that kind of puts us in a box, right, and
Yeah.
the thing is, none of us belong in any box, right, because we're humans, right, like and human beings, and we all have hearts, and we all have brains, and we all have functions, right? All of our you know, body, you know, functions hopefully work, um and yet we forget that. We forget that we're all the same. And that's really profound. And but I, you know, going back to like really sharing like who, like how you were you understood who you were so early on, but your early conditioning was kindness, right? And I love that. You know, don't kick the dog, take care of the baby chick, right? Like and whether it's literal or not, that's how we should go, and we shouldn't kick our neighbors. We shouldn't kick,
Right.
I mean, we shouldn't kick
Yeah.
anybody.
I mean, look, how we do one thing is how we do all things, right?
Everything, right. So, and so I love that because that's what you've brought into everything that you've touched along the way in all of your careers. And and how at this moment in time, how I feel it is so important that we contrast and actually, I don't even know if it's just this moment in time. You know, now that I teach how the brain and body works, that I teach neuroscience, I teach the biology of how to change, and that it was done through the lens like I really needed to heal because I didn't want to go blind. Um, so so I learned that the mind was super powerful, but it's also um, you know, we have survival mechanisms built into us, right? So when we are afraid, right, you know,
Yeah.
we with the adrenaline rush, and we're in survival. So and what 10,000 years ago, we were in survival because we were hunter-gatherers, and we were, you know, preparing to be chased by a lion or whatever. So all of those mechanisms are like really brilliantly made in our bodies, but we really haven't evolved to the point where we don't need to be in survival like we were when we were first designed, right? And so what we do is we create um, the survival mechanism by thought alone, and
Yeah.
all the advertising, you know, all of the social media, they understand how our brain works, and so it's designed to limbically hijack us.
Right.
And so a lot of reasons why people can't get into the love space is because they're in survival. Um, and so what I wanted to do with this podcast is to teach that, and to just share people like you who understand that as well, but you rise above the noise. And so, you know, so what are some of your thoughts about like how you're showing up every day throughout your career, throughout your life, forget the career, just as a person, and how you keep yourself, you know, pure in that little girl, like, be kind, don't kick the dog, don't squish the chick. Like,
I mean, first I would say, I guess I want to clarify one thing. I think we all fail at it, right? And I think that giving ourselves and each other the grace and maybe the forgiveness and the knowledge that it's inevitable, like we're going to fail. I tell a story in my book Leapfrog that I didn't want to tell. The backstory of that story is that I really was nervous, and this is some of that sort of outside conditioning. When I wrote my book, I worried that it would be considered a self-help book if I put too much of myself into it. And so I wanted it to be a serious business book, quotations for those who are just listening, right? And I didn't want it to be, you know, somehow pigeonholed into the self-help. And again, because in my head, self-help was something, it was negative. It was where the women-oriented books go. And that somehow is, you know, conditioned to mean that it's somehow less valuable. Like, you can go all deep into all the reasons why it was seriously misguided. But that's what I was nervous about. That's what I was, to use your word, that's what I was afraid of, right? I was coming from a place of like, am I going to be misconstrued into being something that is less valuable somehow? And for me, that meant a business book is more valuable than a self-help book. And I didn't want to put my personal stories in. My co-writer insisted, publisher also. And in the end, one of the stories that made it in there is a true story of when I was in my early 20s. I had already sold my first company, and I was now running a multinational that I'd done a joint venture with. And we had a situation with a project in Ireland that had gone sideways, and 3 different groups had come in to try to fix it, and nobody had been able to. And I've always been the sort of, you know, fixer type. And I was the last hope. Like, the client was going to sue this company if we didn't get it together and deliver the product that they needed to then put on shelves. And the long and short of it is that somebody called in sick on the wrong day when we absolutely needed him, and it was mission critical. And I got 3 of my staff members to go physically to his home and bring him into the office by whatever means necessary. And he did. And we made the delivery, and the sort of, you know, that story that we tell ourselves in life or in business, right? The hero story, like the day we saved the day. But then the next day, the same guy called in sick again, except this time he called in sick from the cardiac ward.
wow.
And I remember a staffer telling me this. And the news was delivered in 2 parts. It was first, Natalie, so-and-so called in sick again. And my first reaction was, who cares? Fine. Like, the emergency was yesterday, and he did what he needed to do. And in order to not have a dependency on him, I made sure he trained 3 other people before he left the office that day. So we didn't have that overdependence on one, you know, critical failure point. But then he continued his sentence, and the second part of his sentence was from the hospital.
Yeah. Wow.
And I remember this sort of pregnant pause in the room. And I think what happened to me then, and I think that the romantic idea that somehow you learn a lesson like that, and then for the rest of your life, you're a better human, I don't think it works that way. I think, you know, I'm currently calling you from Ecuador. The cosmology for the indigenous people in the Andes, I am one of them, is that life is a spiral. And if it seems like things repeat themselves, it's because life is a spiral. You're still advancing, you're still moving. But if there's something that seems decidedly similar to something from before, there is a reason for that. And I think that this was one of those spiral moments where I realized in that moment that I had put the life of a human being below the higher priority of profits, success, ego, all the things that will get us, you know? And in that moment, the thing, maybe it was like the hook for me. And the thing that kind of brought me back to center was remembering little Natalie, remembering that little girl who was taught by her family to be kind. And I thought to myself, I could have money, I could have success, I could have so many things, but in this moment, I'm failing my family's teachings. My family taught me to do one thing, and that was to be kind. And I was failing miserably. And, you know, I was not prioritizing a human life, which I should have prioritized above all other things. And I remember that I took the rest of the day off. It was morning. And I remember walking rather aimlessly all around Dublin for the entire day, just kind of sitting with myself and really like swimming in the disgusted feeling that I had about myself. And how did I get here? And what choices did I make that turned me into the kind of person that could even be this thing that I'd become? And so I don't know, I tell that story because I think it's important to remember that, especially if somebody's being held up as how do you do the things that are sort of helpful and good, you've got to sort of balance that with the truth, which is that we're not always getting it right. You know, we're getting it wrong sometimes, and that's part of the spiral, and that's part of, you know, and hopefully you do have a moment, you know, I'm both embarrassed by, but also kind of grateful for that moment, because it was the slap in the behind that I think I needed to sort of wake up from whatever place I had managed to get myself into. Right. And I don't know. I mean, maybe the short answer to your original question is how I do it is to remember that, to remember those dark places and to remember how to get out.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually just when I coach my clients now, I always tell them they have to light a match in a dark place. And that dark place is often places like that, right? Where you kind of you examine it and say, how did I get there, right? Like, and has that informed me? You know, so because sometimes it's unconscious, like something happens, you don't actually go for a walk for a half a day and kind of stare at the mirror, look in the mirror and stare at yourself, right? That's basically what you did. And a lot of people will just stuff it down, right? And then it becomes something that creates behaviors in them, right? So for whatever reason. And so that self-reflection is the tool, right? And it was immediate for you, right? That's basically what I teach. It's like the pause. Like, yeah, that was a mistake, and but you didn't just brush it off, and you didn't like try to defend yourself, right? You had the heart to recognize little Natalie, right? She would never do that, right? And that is, I think, the key in all of life is to practice the pause, to practice that awareness and self-reflection in the moment. So you can kind of, and I actually call it the ascension spiral. Like, and you know, because the thing is like, even as people, as we go through our own journey, which for me now, it's like I'm calling it the self-love and the self-mastery journey, is, to understand, how my thoughts, words, and deeds do matter. How do I align my actions, with my thoughts and my behaviors with my intentions, right? But we are going to come across that, like that situation again, right? But I see it like we start down here, and we just kept bumping into it and bumping into it. And if we don't deal with it, it's just that kind of takes us down a different path. But if we begin to see it, we begin to fix it. But then, we'll spiral up again, but it's going to be there again. You bump into it, but it looks a little different, and we can react more quickly. So is that making sense?
And our reaction evolves, right? I
Right.
see myself stumble all the time. I think about conversations where I think I wish I'd shown up better. I wish I had taken that opportunity to do something differently. But I think that you're right. I think that every time that you bump up against the monsters, the shadow self, all the
Yes.
things that people call the truth of who we are, which is not always perfect and rainbows and unicorns. If we adjust ever so slightly, How great when you can make huge adjustments, like that one day where it was kind of cathartic for me. But I suspect that there were lots of moments before that where I didn't make big adjustments. And now even, moments where I'm still bumping up against the same kind of mistakes. And I think, all right, how am I going to show up this time? What have I learned from the previous times? And so I think there is something to be said about that. Iterative, you're not going to solve it all overnight, and the patience, with ourselves that's required to just understand that that's just the truth of it.
Yeah. And to not go into a self-judgment state, right? Because I think self-judgment is one of the low frequency vibrations, right? It's the one, it's a, and for women in particular, I'd say self-judgment then kind of devolves into imposter syndrome, right? And so I think it's really important at this point in time to be on this, what I'm calling the self-love, the self-mastery journey, because we get to look at these different emotions, these different reactions, and say, how can I do better? How can I do better? And, I interviewed somebody last week, alien abductee, like he, witnessed the whole package. It was in 1969. And I mean, he had me in tears during the interview because, um, you know, he said he has the perspective that most people don't have, right? That there are other beings, that, there are things that beyond the stars that we're like, each one of us is tinier than a speck of dust in the greater universe. And he said, but only each one of us, if we just understood that we could be the speck of dust that shines light, right? And if each speck of dust can just, go back to being the little girl Natalie, right? And do the right thing, I feel like we have a chance. We have a chance at really seeing humanity shift. That's just, maybe I'm too Pollyanna, but whatever.
Well, I want to pause on one thing. Two friends, Ruchika and Jodianne, wrote this Harvard Business Review article that's turned out to now be like one of the most popular articles ever, about the idea of imposter syndrome, right? The fact that it's even called a syndrome means it's yours.
Right.
It's something, it's a disease that you own and that you have, whereas imposter syndrome is something it's this diagnosis that's often given to women, even in the context that you just presented it about, this sort of pitfall that women can fall in. But, the fact that it's even considered a diagnosis is part of the problem, because at the end of the day, when you think about what people refer to as imposter syndrome, it's really the effects of racism, classism, xenophobia, bias, sort of in general.
Yeah.
And the people who own that problem they're not me, they're not you, they're the system, the workplace, the family structure, they're that environment that gives you that anxiety, that we've been pathologized and we've said women have this syndrome. And it's like, no. If you're feeling this in your workplace is broken.
Exactly.
And there's something in that workplace that needs to be fixed, not you.
Right.
Which is what the syndrome diagnosis would suggest. And so anyway, I highly recommend this article. It's fantastic. It's called Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome.
Oh, I love that.
And I think it's part of that. I think it's part of that work, right? I think maybe that's part of the cycle of, like, it is for me. When I find myself thinking that, I go back to, in this case, what I learned from an article written by two friends, and think, hang on a second, who am I laying the blame for something that's broken? Am I laying the blame on myself for reacting the way that a normal human being would react to bias? Or am I blaming the environment that's creating this tension, right?
Yeah. Well, and I love this conversation because I think I had mentioned to you that I, fought a sexual harassment suit when I was very young, in my 20s, right? And pre, anything, pre Anita Hill, and it was so obvious to me. So maybe because of the values I had, there's right and there's wrong, and this was blatantly wrong.
Yeah.
Um, and then, and it had a lot of consequences, right? Because then I
Yeah.
was blacklisted, and I can only find one job, and it was, I was hired because I was a woman, and I had to move cities, all this stuff, right?
Oof, heavy.
And that, really, really was, it struck me as, you know, when we do stand up, right? When we do actually advocate for ourselves, that I was an, it was an aberration. I mean, it was sort of like, and I was just like, how could you not, right? So I'm really proud of my parents and me for not, you know, backing down, right? Not jumping and fighting for the right thing. And by the way, just so all the listeners know, like, you know, I settled because it was a big giant company and they do this thing called break the plaintiff. And so they were going to basically bankrupt me. Um, but my attorney said to me, we kind of did the settlement. He said, bad people usually are bad in more than one area. And I was like,
Mm.
interesting. It really hadn't struck me. And then 2 years later, the guy got walked out in handcuffs by the SEC for cooking the books. And so so here's the
Mm.
point. It's like when we have the courage, right? The fortitude or whatever, not to allow what um has been, sort of fed to us, right? And the financial services industry, I mean, I haven't really been in it for a long time other than a little short stint when I worked in a three-woman C-suite, which was a little bit different, but not totally different. Um, but it was it produced all of those imposter syndrome, for most women, right? Feelings, because we were always having to be better, fight harder, be
Yeah.
smarter, get more degrees, do all this stuff. It's like,
Yeah.
like,
God. I did
yeah.
a tour with I don't know if you remember the Obama White House, and Tina Chen and Valerie Jarrett and Michelle Obama had this thing called the Council on Women and Girls. And one of the programs that came out of that was called the United States of Women. And I built the curriculum for them for entrepreneurs. And Michelle decided that she wanted to take the show on the road and tour the United States of Women all around the country and to the cities that don't typically get access to this kind of content. And so because of that, I was able to teach my curriculum that eventually became this book in places like Albuquerque and Atlanta and Baltimore and Miami and so on. And what was fantastic about it was seeing women who either were entrepreneurial or aspired to be entrepreneurial, thousands and thousands of them in all these different cities, and obviously seeing what was unique about them, but then seeing what they all seemed to share. And one of the things that I joke about is like, how many master's degrees does a woman need? And it's like, it actually is what prompted me to go into finance, because I realized after being exposed to so many brilliant women that while my chosen intervention at the time, I had retired from tech and now I was writing this curriculum and I was teaching at Columbia, so the tool that I chose, the tool in my toolbox that I chose to sort of be in the world in was education. And I still believe passionately about education, in education. But what I realized after meeting all of these women with their way too many master's degrees is that they weren't actually lacking in education.
Right.
They were lacking in among actually not that many things, but that to me, the thing that seemed obvious, that was like the principal thing that they were lacking, was capital. And that's ultimately why I ended up getting into finance, which I never thought I would do. But it's that sort of, how many rules are we going to follow? How many things are we going to do to improve the pedigree and to do the formula that everybody tells us you've got to do in order to be successful? And yet when you do it, there's always another, the goalpost keeps moving.
Oh,
right?
yeah, yeah. When I left financial services, I don't tell very many people this because I started this little company called Dodo Unlimited. I know I use the dodo bird, right? Like, so probably not a great symbol, but I felt to me it represented don't let your individualism become extinct, dare to be different. And I wrote a couple of kids' books, and it was like in my like, you know, mid, I guess, early to mid 30s, and didn't have kids, didn't even have a boyfriend, at the time or anything. And it was sort of like, but I just felt like it was such an important message to sort of start telling. And it was, because I really felt when I worked in financial services that I was leaving my personality in the lobby. As I stepped onto the elevator, like we were almost required to like come out at your floor who they wanted you to be, right? And when you do that for years, like even though if I still have a very strong inner compass, like you begin to, you have to, it's like adapt or perish, right? Like, and in those environments, it was very much survival of the fittest. And so when I was done, I was just like, I don't want this to happen to anybody else. I did not, and I probably should brush it off because it was just a, really great concept. And all the products that I made were made out of recycled goods or hemp or, very environmentally focused. But when I had a push cart at Faneuil Hall, and you're going to crack up, 90% of Americans would go by and go, "What's a doo-doo bird?"
I
So,
guess it's not part of the zeitgeist. Or maybe, what is it? Is it something? I don't think it's a generational thing. I don't know what it
no,
is.
it was like, I was like, I'm either ahead of my time or I picked the wrong bird. But anyway, like I was like, it, it, we weren't the general population, as will I say, was not ready for that
Yeah.
message of don't let your individualism become extinct, dare to be different. And the dodo bird, why did the dodo bird become extinct? Because for all the years it lived on the island of Mauritius, it didn't need to fly, it didn't have any predators. And then when the Portuguese sailors arrived there with their dogs and blah, 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 like, they were beaten, killed and eaten and everything, and then they perished. They were gone, extinct. And so because of their difference, because their wings didn't need to fly, they didn't need to fly, they could just hang out and be happy,
Yeah.
they became extinct. And that to me was just such a powerful symbol. And I feel like it still is. And I don't really have the time to revive the dodo, but anyway, but you get
I
it.
think if we go back, I actually love rehearing the dodo bird story now because I think like a lot of things in history, I was taught that story too. But when I look back at it, right? And in light of the conversation we just had about imposter syndrome,
Right.
like, do we continue to share, if somebody's listening and they didn't know about the dodo bird, like, do we continue to accept a narrative that blames the dodo bird and
Right.
millions of years of evolution, or do we rethink that narrative and talk about the damage of colonialism and violence
Yeah.
and people who showed up someplace and trampled over it and created, an extinction
Yes.
event? Like, there's so many, excuse me, there's so many other things that are also fragile. Maybe they're not as fragile as the dodo bird, but we're trampling over them and we're
Yeah.
going to create more moments of extinction, right?
Yeah.
And it's not as obvious as bringing in a bunch of dogs and animals and rats that eat a bird that doesn't know how to fly. It is more subtle, but it's still happening and it's still real. And do we continue these narratives, you know, blaming the living beings that are just living their lives?
Yeah. No, it's a profound thought, and it's also an important perspective, and one that is why we're talking, we'll take this back to the love conversation, right? This is why we're talking about, if you you would never have landed on the island of Mauritius and killed the dodo birds, right? Like, it just, I
I
would never.
I want to believe that, but you
Right.
know, Carol, my family, my ancestors are among the first settlers of the Galapagos Islands. We still have, you know, there's a couple of towns that are the first two towns that were created sort of in the islands.
Mm,
And you know, it's my understanding that my ancestor used prison labor, you
mm,
know,
right.
to build a settlement on the island, something that was legal at the time. Actually, it's legal in the US still today.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think about whether I would, I mean, I
Yeah.
don't know. Think
No,
about
we
that.
don't know. Yeah,
Someone
you're
with
right.
my blood did step on an
Yeah.
island like Mauritius and did single-handedly decimate multiple species. And so I don't know. I hope that the answer is I would never, but the truth is, you know, I think in that
Yeah.
spiral that we keep talking about, like
Yeah.
it doesn't happen automatically. It's not, we're not on autopilot. I could be my ancestor,
Right.
you
Right.
know, but I
Which,
have to choose and work every day not to.
exactly. That's the mastery journey. That's the self-love journey. It's like, you don't, it's, and it's work, right? And I think that's it. People forget that, like, being a good person takes consciousness. I mean, some of us are naturally good, but the thing is, we could be in an environment, and I was just, I had a thought and it just left me, so maybe it'll come back to me. But like, we still get to choose, right? How we think, how we act, and how we feel. And now, because we're at a different point in time in history, where there is all been a lot of studies about the brain and neuroscience and neuroplasticity and quantum physics, right? Like, we know that we can change using by thought alone. I mean, it is science, right? So it's unforgivable not to teach the neuroscience and the biology of how our brain and body work. We are divine beings. I mean, we are designed for mastery, right? But why not, why not be the masters of love, be the masters of goodness, and that is not what is being taught. And the thing is, as easily as we could feel fear, anger, and vitriol and hate, we could prune those out. I mean, it's neuroplasticity. We do not have to have those emotions. We could as easily move towards joy and love and happiness. And it is a choice. And so, back to, like, could we? Yeah, I mean, I remember what I was going to say. Last year, we were visiting a friend in Charlottesville, and we went and visited, Monticello, and then we went to visit Madison's. I can't remember what his is called, but anyway, and I had I had such respect and conflict about Jefferson and Madison, because they were so enlightened on so many levels, right? Like, in terms of, like, the Declaration of Independence, it was such an enlightened, I mean, the pursuit of happiness, right? All men are created equal.
Mhm.
And then, Madison's genius in writing most the Constitution that we know today, like, but they were both slave owners.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that I think both men were
And they were slave owners at a time that has been misconstrued as a time when there was no voice of dissent, when in fact there was. They were slave owners at a time where they were swimming in waters where lots of people were against the idea of slavery, and lots of people were talking about it and writing about it. And it was, that people talk, oh, this just, they were a product of their times. And it's like, no, there was plenty of voice in their time. questioning, the idea of slavery.
Yeah. So, they're right there. It's like it's like you've got this brilliance, and yet they made a choice to, kind of be like everybody else, right? Like they
Yeah.
and what I felt, and maybe I just made it up, but I felt like they were tortured souls because
Mm,
you can't have the Declaration of Independence and slavery at the same time, right? Like
right.
it didn't sit with me. And I was sad during the whole trip. I was just
Mm,
like, so, but that's that, like, would we like kill the dodos, right?
right. I mean, look, we have ripped from the headlines right now situations that mirror things that we have only read about in history books,
Yeah,
and we used to ask ourselves, what would we do? What would we
right.
have done
Yeah,
during the Holocaust? What would we have done with the dodo bird? I mean, these are questions that we had the distance and perhaps the luxury and the privilege of asking ourselves as hypotheticals, and they're
right,
not anymore, right?
right,
Because these sorts of things are happening right in front of us, and the question of what would we have done isn't really a question anymore. What would we
right,
have done is what we're doing right now,
right. Yeah,
because there are genocides that are happening, and there are moments of extinction, and all sorts of crazy things happening, and the question is no longer a question.
yeah, it
We've
isn't a
answered the
question.
question.
Yeah,
What we're
we
doing is what we would have done.
right. And what we're doing is we're having a conversation about how do we show up in our hearts, right? How do we keep that kindness going? How do we um offer like the light in the dark, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that you actually were mentioning before we started recording was it can be daunting. This is what I think implied, right? It can be daunting to think about how to fix big problems. But if anything, what I'm learning in the last few years and in the last few months and weeks is that the hyper local, hyper specific work is really key, right?
Yeah,
Even if the sphere of influence is small,
yeah,
those things matter, those conversations matter. Looking at your own backyard, your own family, your own friend group, and the work that can be done within that,
yeah, yeah,
shifting hearts and minds. And, you know, I think that is the work right now. It's not the only
yeah,
work, but it's really important. And I don't know that I emphasized it as or understood it to be as important as I realize it is right now.
yeah. Because I think we all looked at like there's a big world out there, right? And now, yes, there is. But when but we first have to bring it back to us, right? We first have to master ourselves, right? Like we really, really do. And I really mean it. Like you've got to take care of yourself. You have to like try to eat as healthily as you can, sleep. Don't like become a doom scroller, right? Like all of this stuff because you need your nervous system to be coherent. You don't want it to be hijacked, right? Um, but don't bury your head in the sand either. And have your practices, right? Breath work, meditation, walk in nature. If you live in a city, just go for a walk. Where are your like Zen place? Go to a museum, right? Find your places where you're going to like that's
Yeah,
going to fill your soul, right? Because we need that, and we have to remember that that's what connects us. That connects us to humanity.
yeah.
Um, but then, you know, the hyper local, it's the grain of sand, connect to another grain
Mhm.
of sand, right? Really, it's
Mhm.
just like, and then eventually we have a beach, right? And so I think that, you know, take care of ourselves, right? We have to be healthy. And then we have to like, and then we go to friends and family, family, friends, and hyper local communities. And then and we need each other. Like
Yeah.
let's face it, let's not be let's not isolate ourselves.
one of the things that I love when it comes to these moments, it's a quote from Alice Walker that just, especially when I'm kind of down on myself and feeling like the work is that hyperlocal work, it's easy to question it and to think it's inadequate. And there's this quote from Alice Walker that goes, and I just brought it up: the real revolution is always concerned with the least glamorous stuff, with raising a reading level from a second grade to third, with simplifying history and writing it down or reciting it for the old folks, or reciting it for the old folks, with helping illiterates fill out a food stamps form, for they must eat, revolution or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
It sounds tedious, it sounds small, it sounds micro, but like you said, all the little grains of salt, of sand, right?
Yeah. And one person at a time, because the thing is, in the coaching work that I do now to help people heal and all that other stuff, it's like, I know if I can get them moved up the emotion scale, like from like if they have a disease, they're scared. If a lot of disease is because they're like in incoherent states of being, right, they're imbalanced, and so get their their emotions kind of up the scale. That I know that higher frequency emotions have an exponential impact on the consciousness of the planet. And so, like, my reason for being is to like do that, right? Remind people to get, and to create the practices to like be in your heart. And here's the other thing, and then we'll have to end, but and I'm going to let you finish with it, but there's a lot of confusion. What is truth, right? And I'm going to tell you right now, where the truth exists? Right here, right here. Like, and you just need to be quiet, and you listen and sit with your heart. And then if something doesn't feel right, ask your heart. Your heart will tell the truth. And I think most of us forget to do that.
Yeah. I will say I struggle with that,
You do.
just because I think there's a lot of broken people.
Yeah.
And you were talking about tortured souls and the founding, fathers. Did they not look in their heart to see what was the real sort of universal truth? Or were their hearts just broken? And are we asking of people something that perhaps they weren't capable of? I want to believe that everyone is capable of sort of finding it deep within themselves, but I don't know. I think these are tough times, and I think that what's important, and this is, I think, why being, for example, for me in Ecuador is really important, is that you can have someone who's broken and lost, and you can limit the amount of damage they do in the world by remembering that life in the world is not about individuals, it's about community.
Right.
And there is something about a community that is somewhat self-regulating, right? You can have the anomalous person who just wants to burn it all down, but if they're in community, the community prevents them from doing that.
Yeah. And I like that reframe. I think it's important. Like I said, I could be a little Pollyanna-ish, and I'm not going to give that up either, because I think that energetically, I want to be that, right?
It's needed. I mean, look, I had a mentee who was given a life sentence in prison as a child at the time when, that's what the US was doing. And he talks, his name is Chris Wilson, and he wrote a book called The Master Plan. And he talks about how the only way he got through, and ultimately through an insane series of impossible events that make the book really compelling and his life really compelling. But the only way that he managed to get out and survive and be alive and functioning, and more than functioning, doing amazing things today, is because of what he calls delusional optimism.
Mm.
And, you know, people would tell him, like, why are you have a life sentence, you don't have parole, like, what are you doing? Why are you wasting your time doing X, Y, and Z? But he had a plan, and he was gonna do it no matter what. And people can call him delusional. And maybe if you look at the facts of his circumstance, maybe, you know, a clinical psychologist would say that there was some amount of delusion. But at the end of the day, it's what allowed him to survive. And more than that, because he's not just surviving now, he's thriving.
Yeah. So, so to any, you know, so optimism and maybe delusional, but I think that we have to hold that light as well, right? And but not without action, and not without you know, with the vision that we want, right? And that vision is back to Natalie as a little girl, Carol as a little girl, for everybody to love each other, for everybody to be kind to each other. And I am not going to let go of that vision.
I'm glad. You shouldn't. No one should.
Exactly. So
even if they call us delusional.
Yeah, well, I always say, you know, because now I'm in my early 60s, and I said, I think it's the granny moment. Like, it's like, never underestimate a planet full of grannies.
Yeah. The youth give me some hope, though, because it seems to not just be reserved to grannies. There are a lot of young people right now standing up and saying, yeah, no, what you all taught us, or what the world taught us, or what we, you know, the messages we got, you know, we're not gonna accept them. And so I'm somewhat excited about that.
Yeah, but I love that then we've got like the barbell curve, right? Like, so we've got the youth and the grannies, and I'm sorry, lovely women all in between, but I maybe because my peer group are mostly my age, right? So, and everybody's like, you know, really taking it very seriously. So, and from operating from that space of, you know, what, you know, maybe we did fall asleep a little over the years. I mean, maybe that will be, I will say that that's probably my greatest failing, because it was all good. It seemed so good, right? Like, and then, but I knew, right? Look, I did the dodo. I got it. I knew there was like stuff, but I just couldn't imagine the level of hate and, you know, and vitriol that we've devolved to. And not we, but, you know, many have devolved to. And I guess, you know, it's you know, we're gonna take it on one grain of sand at a time, and, you know, with love as our it's the greatest power, right? I mean, I think of Wonder Woman, right? What was the last line? Love will save the world. But she was fierce. I mean, she was a warrior. So so any last words, Natalie, for our listeners?
I love the ones you just mentioned, right? I mean, I think for people of color, I don't think a lot of what's happening is very surprising, because the vitriol was always there. It was right under the surface. But I can see how a lot of people kind of missed it for so long, because we did keep it kind of under the rug. I think that it's the time to become warriors of different kinds, right? There's not just one kind, but I think the times are calling us to do that. The times are calling us to tap into that part of ourselves that are going to take a stand, right? In big and small, quiet and loud ways.
Yeah. Thank you, Natalie. And thanks to everybody for listening and tuning in. This is Carol Mirko, and this is A Loud Voice for Love. Thank you. Raise a loud voice for love. Sky above, stars will guide. Together rise, we can move. Feel the power side by side.